Something shifted, not loudly, not with protests or headlines or some big cultural moment everyone remembers. It happened the way seasons change in a city. You step outside one morning and the air just feels different. The light falls at a different angle, and you can't quite name the moment it changed. You only know that it did. Men, in growing numbers, are stepping away from the pursuit of relationships. Not all of them, not forever, not with bitterness written on their faces. Many are simply not chasing anymore, not organizing their whole lives around the idea that partnership is the next thing, the necessary thing, the thing that makes the rest of it mean something. They're building routines, deepening friendships, choosing solitude on a Saturday without feeling like they owe anyone an explanation, learning things just for the pleasure of learning them, living, in other words, without the urgency that once defined what it meant to be a man looking for love. And nobody held a press conference to announce this. There was no single turning point, no film, no statistic, no one betrayal that explains it cleanly. It accumulated, quietly, in apartments, in late night texts, and long walks home, after dates that left people feeling more drained than hopeful, in the slow realization, repeated enough times, that something about the old equation no longer balanced. When did this become normal? That's the question that lingers once you notice the shift. Not why, not yet, just when. When did a man saying, quote, zero stop sounding like an excuse and start sounding like a simple, honest fact about how he's chosen to live? And perhaps what makes this shift unusual is that almost nobody noticed it while it was happening. There are two stories being told about love right now. And the strange thing is, they're being told at the same time by people who live in the same cities, work in the same offices, scroll through the same feeds. They share geography and almost nothing else. The first story is familiar. It says that love is the destination, that a life fully lived is, almost by definition, a life lived in partnership, that the longing for connection isn't just emotional, it's structural, built into what we are. In this story, a person who is alone is a person who is, on some level, still waiting, still in transit, not yet arrived. The second story is newer, or at least it's being told more openly now than it used to be. It says that relationships are meaningful, but optional, that a life built around independence and self-directed purpose isn't a consolation prize. It's a legitimate way to be a human being. That the real question isn't, quote, one, it's whether partnership is something you genuinely want or something you were conditioned to pursue because every story you were handed as a child ended that way. These two worldviews aren't just different preferences, they're different realities. Someone living inside the first story looks at a man who has chosen to stay single and sees either failure or fear, something unresolved, something missing. Someone living inside the second story looks at the same man and sees clarity, intention, someone who examined what was expected of him and decided to move differently. Both are looking at the same person. Both are certain they understand what they're seeing. People can stand in the same world while believing they're living in entirely different realities. And that gap between those two stories is where most of the confusion about this moment actually lives. To understand why so many men are reconsidering what they want, it helps to understand what they were told to want. Because the expectations placed on men didn't arrive as suggestions. They arrived as contracts, quiet, unsigned, but binding in every way that mattered. A man was supposed to provide. Not just financially, though that was central. He was supposed to demonstrate that his presence in a relationship made material life better, more stable, more secure. His worth was, in part, something you could measure by what he could offer in concrete terms. And for most of the last century, that contract had a kind of internal logic. It matched a world where roles were divided cleanly, where the arrangement, however unequal, functioned. A man was also supposed to protect, to absorb threats, to be the steady thing when everything else moved. And alongside all of that came something less talked about, but perhaps more exhausting than anything else: emotional restraint. Men weren't just encouraged to be stoic. In many cases, they were trained to see emotional expression as a weakness, to manage inward and project calm outward, to never quite let the weight show. These expectations didn't disappear when the world changed. They softened at the edges, became slightly less explicit, but the scaffolding stayed. The assumption that a man's willingness to take on responsibility, financial, emotional, protective, was the price he paid for love persisted long after the conditions that made that price reasonable had shifted. The rules changed, but many people still expect the old outcomes. And so, a generation of men arrived at adulthood carrying the weight of expectations built for a world that no longer exists, while being evaluated against standards that had quietly evolved without anyone handing them the updated version. The contract was rewritten, but no one gave them the new draft. For most of history, freedom for men had a particular shape. It wasn't the freedom to be alone, it was the freedom to build, to have a family, a home, a structure that gave daily life coherence and meaning, and a place in the world. To be free, in that older sense, often meant to be anchored. A man without those anchors wasn't seen as liberated, he was seen as unfinished. Something about that definition has been quietly dissolving. Independence now carries a different texture for a growing number of men. It's not the independence of waiting, not the temporary solitude of someone between commitments, marking time until the right person arrives. It's the independence of having examined what commitment would cost and deciding, at least for now, that the cost doesn't match the return. This isn't cynicism, though it can look that way from outside. It's more like a recalibration, a quiet recognition that a relationship doesn't automatically deliver what it was once assumed to deliver: stability, purpose, belonging, meaning. Those things, more men are discovering, can be built without a partner, imperfectly, differently, sometimes in ways that require more active construction, but built. And once that realization settles in, the question shifts entirely. It's no longer quote two, it becomes something more fundamental. Quote three. That question doesn't have a universal answer. For some men, asking it reopens desire, a clearer, more honest desire, free of pressure. For others, it resolves into something else entirely, into a life organized around different things: work, art, friendship, travel, the particular pleasure of deciding how a Sunday morning goes and answering only to yourself. Freedom once meant access to relationships. Now, for many, it means the ability to choose whether they need one at all. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't register in the body. It doesn't make your legs heavy or your eyes want to close. It settles somewhere deeper in the part of you that handles effort, the part that decides how much of yourself to offer and to whom and in what direction. And when that part has been strained enough times without return, it develops something that isn't quite cynicism and isn't quite indifference. It's quieter than both: a conservatism of energy, a reluctance to spend what has already been spent too many times. Modern dating, for many men, has become the primary site of this exhaustion. It's not that every experience is bad. It's not that every connection ends in disappointment. It's the aggregate, the accumulated weight of showing up, extending yourself, trying to read what someone needs while also trying to present a version of yourself that is simultaneously authentic and appealing, and not too much and not too little. The performance of it, the careful calibration of response times, the decoding of signals that shift without warning, the persistent low-grade sense that the version of you being evaluated isn't quite the version of you that actually exists, and beneath the performance, something else: structural uncertainty, not the romantic kind, which can feel alive, but the kind that makes you ask, after months of real investment, whether you're building something or simply auditioning, whether the effort you're putting in is heading somewhere or just disappearing. This is the exhaustion that doesn't get named. It lives in the decision, made quietly, without announcement, to stop engaging with dynamics that consume without replenishing, in the man who steps back, not because he's given up on connection, but because the particular form connection was taking was costing him more than it was giving back. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. That's precisely the point. It's a quiet door, closed without anger. And behind it is someone who decided that stillness, real stillness, was worth more than the noise of trying. There is a difference between being alone and feeling at peace. And it's one of the most consistently misread distinctions in any conversation about men who choose solitude. The assumption, repeated so often it's become reflexive, is that aloneness and emptiness are the same condition, that a man who is single is a man who is lacking something, that behind the composed surface there is longing being carefully managed or pain being poorly concealed. And sometimes, yes, that's true. Loneliness is real. The ache of wanting connection and not having it is not something to minimize. But it is not the only thing solitude can be. For a growing number of men, the shift into intentional solitude has not produced loneliness. It has produced something that, for lack of a better word, resembles relief. The morning that belongs entirely to them. The weekend that doesn't need negotiating. The mental space that, once freed from managing a complicated dynamic, can go somewhere toward work that matters, toward friendships chosen deliberately, toward the slow building of a life that feels, in its texture and pace, genuinely theirs. They're discovering hobbies, not as compensation for what's missing, but as expression of what they're finding, deepening friendships that were previously treated as secondary, building routines that hold them, not because routines replace intimacy, but because they provide a structure in which the self can actually develop. Silence and emptiness are not always the same thing. This might be the most important reframe available to anyone trying to understand this moment. Choosing to be alone is not always running from something. For many men, it is running toward something, toward a life that asks less performance and offers more presence, toward mornings that feel full rather than hollow. Women noticed it gradually, not all at once, not with a single revelation, but the way you notice a change in someone's behavior when you've known them long enough, not through one moment, but through a pattern, a slow accumulation of smaller moments that each felt slightly off, until, eventually, they fit together into something legible. The pursuit was different, less urgent, less organized around impressing. Men who had previously been attentive in ways that felt almost strategic were now present, but without the forward momentum that presence used to carry. Texts came when they came. Plans materialized when they materialized. And when they didn't, there was no performance of effort to fill the gap. It wasn't coldness, exactly. It was more like disengagement from a particular kind of expectation, a quiet refusal to enter the competitive dynamics that had previously structured so much of early romantic interaction. Men weren't withdrawing from women. Many were maintaining friendships, enjoying conversations, moving through the world with warmth perfectly intact. They were withdrawing from a posture, from the assumption that their job was to pursue, to prove, to demonstrate worthiness through sustained and escalating effort. And women watching this began asking different questions. The first one was defensive. What did we do? The second was more diagnostic. What happened to them? And the third, the one that required the most stillness to hear clearly, was structural. What changed? Not what changed in men specifically. What changed in everything? In the expectations both sides carry. In the scripts that told each of them what they were supposed to want and how they were supposed to go about getting it. The question slowly shifted from, why aren't they trying harder? To, what changed? Here is where the most important misreading tends to happen. When men step back from dating, from pursuit, from the whole performance of availability, the interpretation that arrives first, the one that feels most intuitively correct, is rejection. He's not interested. He's choosing differently. He found something else. But rejection and selection are not the same thing, even when they produce the same visible behavior. Rejection is indiscriminate. It's a turning away from a whole category. From women, from relationships, from intimacy itself. Selection is different. It's a turning toward a standard, a decision that energy, time, emotional presence, and vulnerability are finite, and will be extended carefully toward people and situations that are genuinely worth what they cost. Many of the men who appear to be withdrawing are not withdrawing from connection. They're withdrawing from the undifferentiated expenditure of themselves that modern dating seemed to demand. They're declining to perform availability just to meet a social expectation. They're becoming more deliberate, less willing to mistake activity for progress, less willing to spend months in ambiguity because asking for clarity felt like too much. This isn't rejection. It's a form of respect for their own time and for the seriousness of genuine intimacy. It's the understanding that a relationship entered deliberately, after honest assessment, after both people have actually said what they want. That's worth waiting for. While a relationship entered out of social momentum, out of the fear of being alone, out of the pressure not to be seen as someone who couldn't make it work, that's something else entirely. Walking away and choosing carefully can look identical from a distance. The difference is interior, and when you understand it clearly, it looks less like a rejection of love and more like a more honest attempt to find it. There is a force that none of this conversation can afford to ignore. It's so ambient that pointing to it almost feels redundant, and yet failing to name it would leave the whole picture incomplete. It is the force of constant comparison, immediate, total, unavoidable, that social media has inserted into the experience of romantic life. For most of human history, the people you could fall in love with were the people in your world, geographically close, socially familiar, met slowly through shared environments, through the gradual process of just being around each other. Attraction developed in the presence of imperfection, because imperfection was all there was. Nobody could compare their partner's Tuesday evening to someone else's curated weekend highlight reel. Now, everyone can, and not just potential partners. The relationships themselves become objects of comparison. You can watch in real time what other people's love appears to look like. The gestures, the anniversaries, the trips, the declarations. You can develop without any intention to a sense of what love is supposed to look like, a template, an expectation of romantic performance that no real relationship could ever sustain, because no real relationship was designed to be a performance. This distorts expectations on every side. Men feel measured against a composite standard assembled from 1,000 curated images. Women feel the same, and both arrive at actual human connection already faintly disappointed by it, because the person in front of them cannot compete with the idealized version they've been absorbing for years. The result is a paradox: more apparent access than any generation in history, and more dissatisfaction than that abundance should logically produce. Infinite options, increasing uncertainty about what any of them are worth. A quiet, persistent sense that somewhere, just beyond what you currently have, something better might be available, which makes committing to the actual and imperfect feel, in some hard to name way, like settling. Pull back further, and what comes into focus is not a crisis between men and women. It's something larger. A culture quietly renegotiating its most fundamental assumptions about how a life should be built. Marriage rates are declining across most of the developed world, not because people have become more selfish, but because people have become more conscious. Conscious of the difference between choosing and defaulting. Conscious of the gap between a life that is genuinely desired and a life assembled from someone else's instructions. Conscious, in a way previous generations were rarely permitted to be, that there are multiple ways a human life can be organized, and that the default version is not automatically the best one. Men are delaying commitment. Some are letting go of it entirely, but so are women, increasingly. The decline in partnering isn't a story about one gender. It's a cultural current playing out differently across genders because the expectations each side inherited were different, but flowing from the same underlying source. That current is the slow replacement of inherited scripts with deliberate choice, the quiet refusal of the life you were supposed to want in favor of the life you actually want, which first requires asking yourself what that is, which requires a kind of stillness and honesty that the old scripts never made room for. because the old scripts assumed you already knew. Success, once organized almost entirely around external milestones, career, marriage, property, children, in roughly that order, is being quietly redefined. Individual fulfillment is moving toward the center. Not the fulfillment of having completed the expected checklist, but the fulfillment of having paid close enough attention to yourself to know what you actually needed, and having had the courage to go toward it, even when it didn't match the template. Return, for a moment, to the original shift, the one that happened without headlines, without ceremony, without anyone gathering to witness or record it, men stepping away from the default pursuit, choosing stillness, choosing themselves, or at least the ongoing project of themselves, for now. It would be easy to read this as retreat, as evidence of something broken in men, in women, in the culture that shaped both of them. Easy to build an argument about fear or damage or the failure of some institution that was supposed to hold things in place. But maybe the more honest reading is simpler, and in its simplicity, more quietly unsettling. The kind of unsettled that comes just before a clearer understanding. Maybe what's happening isn't that men are rejecting love. Maybe what's happening is that more people, men and women, are becoming unwilling to choose lives they were expected to live, and more willing to choose lives they genuinely want. And maybe the fact that those two things don't always look the same from the outside isn't a problem to be solved. It's simply a reality to be understood. The question was never really about staying single. It was always about something larger, what it means to choose deliberately, to live with intention, to refuse the inherited script, not out of rebellion, but out of something more patient and more honest, out of a genuine desire to understand yourself well enough to know what you're actually choosing and why. And if more people are choosing differently today, if the old templates are loosening and the old certainties are softening, does that mean something is broken? Or does it simply mean that people are finally deciding for themselves?